Everybody, my name is Bob Mazzotti. I'm one of the senior security sales engineers for Gigamon, specifically focusing on the ThreatINSIGHT platform. Former life, I was actually an incident responder for about the last 4 years, and then prior to that, network security architect. I'm also joined by Greg Ricketts. Let me pass it over to Greg to give a quick intro to himself.
Cool, thanks, Bobby. Hey, everybody, thanks for joining today. My name is Greg Ricketts. I am a regional engineering lead, director technical services for the region Maryland, down in the Carolinas. Also lead engineer for Access IT Group with Gigamon. So really excited for the presentation today to show you what ThreatINSIGHT brings to the table, and happy to answer any questions that you all have on how we can incorporate the Gigamon visibility fabric into the ThreatINSIGHT platform. And further enable your security needs. So with that, back to you, Bobby, and
Cool.
Looking forward to the presentation. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Greg. Yeah, so kind of a quick abstract as to what we're going to be covering in terms of what completing the visibility triad really with NDR means overall. So when you actually start taking a look at security operations teams, or SOCs for short, they've matured quite a bit. They've employed a number of solutions to combat typical cybersecurity threats. But traditionally, most SOCs have relied on a SIEM and a modern EDR tool for detection and investigation needs. Now, while these tools are definitely critical to the security operations, they have their visibility limitations. EDRs can be a little bit more noisy and only show you essentially what's fired from the known threats on those devices, even down to service manipulation, but they don't tell you how the activity went from point A to point B. A SIEM, and it's right, has ultimately taking a look at a generalized data set. It could be from multiple different data points. Doesn't necessarily always focus strictly on the security aspect of things. It could be from the operations and performance side of the house. And security teams have turned to the network really for that added detection visibility. Network detection and response solutions provide the necessary visibility, not available to a SIEM or an EDR. And SOCs have to really complete that security architecture to get the full picture. How did the actual activity, especially from an east-west perspective, make its way between those two different devices? So in this session, we'll discuss traditional security architectures and how they're being optimized using NDR into a modern security architecture, and ultimately, going forward as to how we start preventing against these more malicious and undiscovered attacks. So let's talk about what happens after the detection. Really trying to do a deep dive as to what the preventative measures might have missed. Who's typically the ones that are actually causing the issue? Easy guess. Most of the times it's typically your users. And you really need the right data at hand to really effectively respond to the activity. So start of the conversation, why we need the right data for visibility, right? When you actually start taking a look at your current architecture, do you know what's actually happening east-west? Or are you really still focusing on what's happening at your endpoint and then up to your perimeter level of your firewall? So I usually like to refer to a pretty good talk by Tim Crothers, Are Breaches Inevitable, from 2018, in which he describes the defender's dilemma. So in his talk, Tim said that while preventative measures are necessary and should be implemented, they will also invariably fail. And when they fail, you need to have the right data collected in order to properly detect and investigate the threat activities effectively. Having great data is one thing. Having rich data is going to be a lot better for you. It's going to not only succinctly get you into your response or your triage to what is affecting your environment, but ultimately provide you the context as to what was carried out by this potential attack, what was carried out by this threat actor. And then down to the level of when we actually focus on what's happened after the detection, we need the right data collected in order to validate that detection. And having that right kind of data is an essential part of triage and investigation. So when you actually go through a triage, a lot of the questions that historically I used to ask, and most defenders ask today, is what's the detection trying to tell you? What did the threat actor carry out? And what additionally did the threat actor do? Because detections are a great starting point, but ultimately that's not the full picture for you. That's just telling you potentially what have we identified from an indicator base as to what activity is being carried out, but it's not giving you the full picture as to what additionally did they do. Did they just get in there to show that they have access to your environment and that's about it? Could be. A lot of the times they're trying to do some sort of exfiltration, gain some monetary value out of this, or become a little bit more destructive just to show the power that they have at hand. If you don't have that right data and you don't have the data context with it, you're ultimately missing a good part of the story. That will then eventually increase your dwell time, reduces your containment time, and from that, it increases your exposure time. And you ultimately need a playbook to actually be able to speak to a lot of these different areas. So that's part of what happens after the actual detection. What carried out, what data do you have at hand? Because in most cases, your firewall is only as good as being able to prevent things from the outside. It's not preventing essentially what happens when the user brings the laptop and is sitting inside your lateral portion of your switch. So let's take a look at a traditional security architecture, right? What teams are usually exposed to 9 times out of 10, what especially in the SMB and the mid-market, you usually see as basic gold standards or your basic foundation, right? And the foundation's a great starting point, but you have to really start to evolve as to how the threats are actually evolving in today's environments today. So in a traditional architecture of security products, employed by many organizations, most security teams send every log, everything they can think of into their SIEM. Now imagine me just having 50 people speak to you at one time and you trying to decipher from those conversations, who should I focus on first? How can I actually clear up the noise, ultimately what I'm looking for? And they're sending all of these logs to your security SIEM for analysis. And some of these tools have the capability of breaking down a little bit of the noise, but it's still up to you as the practitioner to figure out where do I need to focus first. As I said before, SIEMs are great, right? They complete a triad when you have an EDR, an NDR, and a SIEM. But you still need that correlation as to what's happening, and you also need that actual, enriched data to get you what you're looking for. So this is where they're going to collect, store, and retrieve a lot of the data for validation. Your SIEM is ultimately that place that you're usually sending things to. Now, while SIEMs collected and store logs extremely well, they were really never intended to collect the vast amounts of event data that can be produced by both networks and endpoints and other devices, your IoT devices, your OT devices, if you're in a manufacturing side of the house. So furthermore, when orgs are extremely large in size, their SIEMs tend to degrade in performance. That query that might have taken when you first deployed it, maybe 5 to 10 minutes to run an actual quick flow request to see what communication are we seeing from SMB. As you start adding more devices and layering that on, kind of like the 7-layer dip, you start to figure out how do I get to those lower levels, and it takes a lot more time, especially if you're doing things like full PCAP, to investigate and then ultimately time and correlate that to when did the attack carry out. So as they start to degrade in performance because of the vast amounts of data that needs to be searched through, this slows analysis. The investigation times for your security operations teams takes a lot longer, and it becomes actually a lot harder as you go through things. You're really one of the biggest things that we start to see as we go through these typical analysis and triage of different data points. We have to try to figure out how do we correlate all of these different events to a streamline of when we might have been breached. Hopefully that's not the case. When an engagement from an IR team starts, or even down to the level of you have signed up and did a great job of saying, hey, we need to be red team. We need to have a pen test done. Can you detect their activity and how they're carrying it out? How many different tools do you have to spread across to figure out what's going on there? And like I said, SIEM is a great purchase. It needs to be a purchase. You need to start being able to correlate a lot of these different things, but you need to have the right data at hand. So it's not always cheap to store every event underneath the sun. I think a lot of us can attune to some vendors out there that charge for every EPS event coming underneath the sun. For the SMB or the mid-size, it's probably not a problem, right? There's not a ton of data that you really need to store or correlate depending on your service or your silo that you sit in, the vertical that you're serving up to. But larger orgs have so much data to collect and store to normalize events, normalize fields, timestamp. They all require maintenance and a knowledge of the data types. And from the storage side of the house, you might have allocated storage over to your virtualized environment, and then some over to your DevOps team, and then some over here. And then the security team comes in there and says, I need 1 petabyte worth of data so that I can look back at least 7 to 10 days. And the rest of the team say, well, you just took our entire LUN out. That's not possible. So you then start to shorten your timeline as to how long you can store this data for. There's a lot of cloud platforms out there that have the ability to store this data, but that also costs operation hours, and it requires manpower to actually, know how to actually store the data out there and actually be able to retain it and pull it down. So creating detections, alerts requires definitely specific knowledge and expertise around some of these areas of normalizing the events and creating fields and timestamps that were, underneath that. So take an example. So it takes time and expertise to research a new detection, a tactic or technique, even look for a signature inside Suricata, prototype that, build a detection and a rule, test it for accuracy, and then tune as necessary, and then repeat that cycle over again. Because if you think about it, if you're just deploying a single detection for maybe some sort of tactic that's being done to your environment, you saw previously before that, say it changes. Let's take a look at Emotet. Emotet now starts to, has evolved previously from the beginning of this year to what it is now. And I'm sure a lot of you are seeing it in the news, how it's deployed, how ransomware is actually deployed. Now, if you built a detection for version 1 of that type of attack, you need to make sure that you're also following that trend, and having a security research team is fairly costly, and it's tough for regular organizations to take care of that. So even some of the most well-funded security programs can fail due to slow response times, not having the right tool and not having the right data, and the right data at the right time as well too. So let's take a look into specialized systems, right? A quick intro, a quick 101 as to what this means. So you can see here from what an EDR does, right? Collects the endpoint data, runs a process analysis. It's ultimately look at the endpoint to see what has changed or manipulated since I first was installed in here, and are there any known signatures from my database that the security research from our vendor has actually identified in here, and can we sanitize that as of right now? That's a great starting point. I always think EDR is a great place. You see a lot of vendors actually starting to shift their game as to they were just strictly AV, and now they have EDR. The nice thing about EDR is not only the service manipulation at the endpoint device itself, but it also has the ability to do log collection and then send that up for analysis. So you don't always have to rely strictly on the tool itself to understand and see what they're showing you. You also have the ability to take those, pull those off, and then fork it over to some other tool to do that. Now, as security industries evolve and practitioners recognize the importance of utilizing specialized systems to collect and store data and analyze the data from networks and endpoints, these systems, EDR and NDR, work complementary together. You can see essentially what NDR does. NDR actually identifies what happens from point A to point B. What's in between there? Starts looking at that north-south traffic, something that you have a good preventative measures, but you don't know how it got between point A to point B. East-west traffic, the most invisible portion of your network. What's laterally happening between our business silos? What's laterally happening across our switches? And then ultimately from down to the level of the protocol inspection. So EDR focuses on the endpoint telemetry data, what process ran, when, where, why, by whom, what did those processes do. NDR focuses on the network, the traffic, who communicated, when, what protocol was used, and what was the content. Ask a question, research, get an answer. Between the two tools, you now have the full picture. Add SIEM in there, and you have the global picture. Both are specialized systems, and they're designed to collect, store, analyze, enrich the specific data that they collected, and each has their own visibility limitations. However, together, they complement themselves very well. So let's start taking a look as to how we can get better, right? Get better over time. That's the goal for any security team, to really start to understand what is the full picture and what do I need to really kind of create that gold standard. So now if you actually have a revised traditional security approach, we introduce NDR and EDR as the intermediaries between the network traffic and the endpoint activity. The NDR and EDR solutions start to store all those specific telemetry data that they're designed to collect and analyze. And then they feed the SIEM solution the relevant detections and the related important events. right? And that's key. I mentioned earlier that generalized data points, that's great. Enriched data points are a lot better. But enriched data points that are actually important to the activity that might have been carried out in your environment are going to start to reduce that alert fatigue issue, that dwell time. How do I actually get to the ability to start understanding what happened in my environment? Because my job, my responsibility as the analyst, the security practitioner, the network security architect, anybody in that role has to not only understand what happened, but they also have to document it because they have somebody else that they need to report to. And the last thing that they need is not having the right data, which causes a resume generating event. Nobody wants that situation, but it can happen, right? And it has happened. So starting to take a look as to how security needs to evolve with the different types of attacks. Let's take an example of an X509 certificate or a Let's Encrypt SSL sign certificate coming into the environment, right? Legitimate signer. But from those types of attacks, it's open source. So now attackers and even red teamers are starting to get a little bit more sophisticated, saying, hey, this is actually unique. This is legit. This is, expected activity inside my environment. But if you don't have the ability to start correlating what's happening on your network and who they're reaching out to, especially if it's a form of exfil, you don't have the data in hand to figure out how far and wide did this spread.
Hey, Bobby.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, hey, I think this is especially with this slide coming up, I think this is a good time to address some of the Q&A that we got so far.
Let's go for
it. I answered those in the Q&A chat there, but at a high level, right? One of the questions was, we've heard SIMs are dead, right? And if so, are we trying to replace this here, or does SIM still have a play? And in addition to that, right, there's a lot of conversation around, MDR, NDR, EDR, right? What do they mean? How do they work together? And I think the message here is that I don't think that we're trying to say that any of these technologies are dead, but rather there's synergy in between all of them, right? And once they're correlated and working together, right, they further bolster your security posture there, give you better visibility into the threats and everything that you could be on your network, right?
Yeah, so I don't think SIMs are dead. I think SIMs are coming into what's considered, and I hate to say this, it's a marketing term, but it is correct in a way, right? As things evolve and digital transformation really continues to take effect, you have to take a look at the next generation SIMs, the ones that are ultimately going to provide you more context, really provide you the flexibility for integration. Because the one thing that I always found with SIMs is that they didn't really stay in their swim lane very often. They tried to do too many things at once, and they didn't rely on their strategic alliance partners to really start to bolster that full capability of what that technology could do. You look at NDR and EDR. With EDR, ultimately, they were looking to try to even solve that problem themselves, saying that, hey, we have all the data, you send it all over to us, we're going to essentially do the same thing. That is not a true case. So you really have to look to your vendors to make sure that they're actually speaking truth and staying inside their lane, knowing essentially what they're good at, focusing their research, focusing their engineering efforts essentially around that. And as you can see from here, this comes from a conversation from Anton Chopkin from Gartner. SIM, EDR, and NDR really create that full visibility. Starts to create, that SOC visibility triad, right? I'm sure most of you have heard of the CIA triad. Well, this is the SOC visibility triad to start to really bolster, that proper hygiene. Because with SIMs, you start to be able to actually report things like security transaction logs from your Active Directory system. You're not going to see that from your EDR or your NDR. It's a generalized, very specific, point. Your sysmon logs to start taking a look at operations that are running on there. You still need a way to present that, and utilizing too many different open source tools, they have their limitations. There's people that are working on GitHub at their free available time, which most of us don't seem to have these days, and you're relying on them to actually get you the data that you're looking for. You need to be able to start taking a look at those service manipulations. You need to be able to ultimately be able to report from it as well too. So I would never really say SIM is dead. Some people have said that. I think what has ended up happening is that SIMs have become too bloated. And there's a lot of good, startup companies coming out there. There's a lot of the enterprise ones that have realized, kind of this message. Have we gone too far and wide and beyond our actual capabilities? to provide what we initially set out to do, is providing a analytics platform to give us what we're looking for, and then to bring all of these different strategic partners together. So I would never say it's dead. I think it just needs to shift and evolve. Like, what I'm kind of talking about here is organizations need to shift and evolve into a better foundation, to be able to actually address these types of attacks and malicious activities, even down to governance level stuff.
Yeah, that's great stuff, Bobby. And, I think that this slide sort of brings it home to a certain extent, at least based on the questions that we've received so far, right? Showing the triad, or, I use the term trifecta of how SIEMs, NDRs, and EDRs can work together to achieve that visibility, right? So I'll turn it back over to you, and we'll keep going here.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's a great question, and it's one I've heard before as well too. Is your NDR a SIEM? No. NDR is a specific, capability of being actually, the ability to investigate. And I'm running a demo a little bit later here today, to kind of show essentially the separation between the two. And they do really need to correlate together. So with EDR and NDR and a SIEM, this three operates in, Gartner calls the SOC visibility triad, right? The EDR and the NDR solutions perform the specialized analysis, right? And here the term specialized, staying in their swim lane, of endpoint and network data respectively. And then they feed that relevant information over to a SIEM, because a lot of security teams have actually utilized a SIEM as their foundational investigation, platform. There's a syntax, built within inside there. There's a little bit of a learning curve. So to also, bring in the requirements to learn another syntax sometimes is not, applicable to that security team. They don't really want to step outside that bounds. So your EDR and NDR also need to be flexible. I always, utilize the term, well, not utilize the term, but the technology, right? It needs to be a RESTful API. It needs to have those tie-ins to up-level and co-process with your SIEM, and really co-process with your security governance and your playbooks. Not really the technology. The technology is going to solve certain things. It's going to solve a problem, but it also needs to address the needs of the people. People process technology is a big deal. And if you don't have, the people and process, the technology is just not there. And the process is one of the biggest things. It's that investigation theory. It's that, understanding, why am I looking for this and why am I doing this? So bringing the EDR and the NDR and their special analysis, this makes a SIEM more efficient. Provides SOCs with the tools that they need to complete the visibility and coverage of their network for detection, investigation of threats. So let's go back a little bit to discuss NDR. Right. So it's necessary to incorporate NDR into security architectures, because EDR and SIEM are not perfect. Right. They have their specific limitations when it comes to coverage of devices. EDR relies on agents to collect telemetry data, right, which requires a deployment theme and methodology, keeping up with that, especially with your help desk and your SOC security operations team, making sure all devices are covered. SIEM relies on logos to be sent for analysis, logs to be sent for analysis, and logs typically don't contain or do not include all the details necessary to perform accurate threat detection. Right? And the solution is to turn to the network, really the source of the truth and what all of us operate on today. And as we mentioned, when you send all your network data, NetFlow, metadata, et cetera, directly to the SIEM, which is not designed to handle that amount of load and level of events, it becomes unusable. Not to mention the fact that it will cost an arm and a leg to store all that data. And we know that the more data you send over to it, the increased potential and cost, depending on the different SIEM that you look for, it can become burdensome and the most costly portion of your environment. So that is where NDR shines. NDR solves the issue that exists with EDR and SIEM, and the three together do make a perfect SOC visibility triad. Start looking at the different types of devices that we can cover, starting to take a look at the different log levels that you're looking for, the protocol specific things versus the process specific on EDR. Your SIEM taking in to be able to actually correlate transaction logs from your Active Directory, pulling down some things from your firewall, looking at things from the perspective of your routers or switches to look at performance things, right? So that's where I say SIEMs are not dead. They just need to evolve into a different way. And many vendors out there have. It's up to you as the customer who's going to subscribe to it to push your vendors. Don't play the just trust us, kick the tires. See, is this something that a company is not only willing to listen to your feedback and what you need and have it designed for your needs, but ultimately, is it going to cover the greater good? All right. So if we take things even a step further, we can introduce SOAR, right? So we went back, we kind of covered the EDR, the NDR, and the SIEM. But now let's take a look into orchestration. Now, this is something that's not new, but it's getting that slow adoption, right? I always trade it back to the adoption of virtualized technology. Virtualization, everybody was against it, but then they started realizing to cover rack storage, power at bare metal for an individual operating system, not the best utilization of the resources. And companies that had full-size racks went down to half-size racks. That's where I start to look at the orchestration side of the house in terms of the trend. We can introduce SOAR to orchestrate, perform automated response for security teams, right? This is what we would consider a modern security architecture. Ask the question, investigate, get the answer, create an action from it. And a SOAR is ultimately, like I said, a specialized tool where it's necessary to make some systems perform or operate smoothly. A lot of the conversations or the webcasts that I've done in the past, it's been to address the issue of security workforce. Our teams are strapped. There's 3 of us. We wear multiple hats, even though our background might be an analyst. You need to take a look as to how can I solve this? And a lot of the things can be orchestrated, right? You've identified a device that's infected. We've seen, some sort of carry out of malware. The network is saying that it's trying to spread wildly. Okay, from our playbook, we're going to create an action to ACL off the communication for this device, move it to the side, sandbox it for a minute, and figure out, can we address what's happening here? And did it, in fact, cause more issues? So there's 4 main areas of capability with an NDR, that an NDR really should provide for security analysts. Detection, right? What's the detection trying to tell me? The ability to look at high fidelity detections, more the threat actor tactics and techniques, not relying so much on anomalistic based correlation, because anomalies bubble up at regular points in time, and that's not always a direct indicator of a threat. Right? It's not always going to say, hey, this is, I use the example that I ran into in the past. All of a sudden I saw, I was utilizing a tool for NTA, and I was seeing, it went from 20 systems alerting me to 200 to 300. And I was working in a call center at that point. And obviously roof's on fire. I'm trying to figure out what's going on here, to come to figure out that actually all the phones had rebooted because the CUCM wasn't available. So they rebooted, CUCM came back, they started registering, but then they were looking for their NTP server and they were beaconing out. But it wasn't really a beacon, it was more of a broadcast, and they were essentially just looking to update their timetables. But my tool was saying, hey, we're seeing C2 beacon with some potential jitter. Well, of course it's going to be jitter because it's going to cycle each time it reaches up. I just spent a lot of time trying to figure out, why is the roof on fire and why did our preventative measures not take care of this? Right? Then you get into the respond aspect, actually enabling an analyst to quickly prioritize and triage the detection, really reduce the mean time to respond, right? In short, MTTR. I'm sure a lot of you are saying MTTD, mean time to detection, mean time to response. That's really what it means, is getting the actual ability for the analyst to run that response and have the right data at hand. They're not having to spread across, 7 or 8 different tools. Then it gets into the actual investigation, empowering an analyst to really validate, is this a true positive, or is this a domain that we expect to interact with? Am I reaching out to network solutions, or am I reaching out to, another VPS provider that's hosting our rack that, sometimes, their VPN might, flag? Fine, but get me the details so that I can actually figure this out and move on to the next thing, right? And the last one is hunting, right? So hunt on network traffic. And it's always been called threat hunting. Of course, you're looking for threats inside your environment. You're looking for those low and slow players. What I always consider hunt is hunting for misconfigurations in your environment, finding those unknown unknowns that might ultimately result in a detection, or hopefully not, a breach. Right? You still need that data at hand and that powerful search capability to really start looking at these things proactively. Because once you sanitize a lot of your detections, how are you going to use that tool going forward? Well, you don't want to have those detections fire up again, and they will. But for the most part, you want to have the ability to figure out how to get in there. Is my DevOps team, have they actually been doing some work and all of a sudden we have an AWS environment? Great. From their AWS VPC security groups, have they locked it down? Well, you need to have that data at hand to figure out what ports and protocols they're communicating to, and are they running a bad version of Apache Struts, or are they opening up admin ports to the outside just because it's easier for them and they don't want to have to log into the VPN? And this is not a throw at DevOps team members, but they've got a job and they have to do it relatively quick because business demands them to move on with the product as they go forward. So the how-to, right? How do we get this information? So inside ThreatINSIGHT or inside an EDR, an NDR, what you're doing is, network sensors are ultimately deployed in an environment and they passively collect network traffic for analysis, right? So during this analysis process, the sensor ingests the raw network traffic. For us, it extracts the metadata and the payload for inspection and the data necessary underneath that, right? Then network events, right, are created based upon the extracted metadata. So these events could be or are a record of keeping everything happening on the network and are typically a foundation for our threat detection capability, right? So what we start to actually look for is we look for things like DNS and HTTP. And something that we actually really, pride ourselves on is doing what's called sessionized metadata, right? Being able to follow that flow, from the flow, and I'm not talking about net flow or anything like that. I'm talking about from the flow perspective of an NDR's job is to not only be able to detect the activity, but you need to be able to figure out the steps or the tactics, the techniques that they carried out. And from the network side of the house, what's the indicators? Indicators typically are the protocols. What domain did they reach out to? When was it? When did it happen? What type of, was it HTTP traffic? Was there FTP traffic coming across there? What's the least time? Is this a new system that fired up that we had no idea about and has containerized itself inside our network and we weren't really, aware of it? And I always find metadata actually, when from an extraction standpoint, extracts and allows you to respond a lot quicker than your typical full PCAP. Now, full PCAPs have their place in modern networks today. One of the biggest things that I look at from the full PCAP side of the house is being able to actually do file extraction from there, try to figure out what's going on. But if NDR has the technology to start taking a look at the safe portion of it, right? Static file analysis, is this a JPEG or is this the GIF image that's made its way into our environment? You run a little bit of threat intel against that. And you start trying to figure out from a fingerprinting standpoint, is it a bad MD5 hash? A lot of the times there's a well-known catalog out there for that type of activity. But can you break down the executable that was originally a PNG file and start to figure out, is there a reconnaissance table underneath there? Has somebody actually tried to do some RICO in the environment and then from there start to store and potentially exfil? Is that device beaconing outside the environment? Now, when you actually start to implore all of these into the full picture, like I stated at the beginning, data is good, data enriches a lot better. So once metadata is extracted, and this is our process for NDR, it's normalized and then it's enriched, right? And during the enrichment, we want to bring the intelligence from third party in our research team to provide context to the events for analysis. You need to have that data at hand for not only your needs as a customer, but you also need to make sure that our analysts have that data at hand to make sure that we're seeing if there's any bad activity. Is SSL utilizing non-443 and it's using 449 or 447, right? And this step is really important, right? Because the enrichment information is extremely useful for analysts, right? To perform the response, the actual investigation of actions, and having this information at their fingertips during the response investigation really cuts down on the time it takes to perform these actions. Improving organizations, security operations, and really getting that full picture. And that's the name of the game. Get the full picture at hand so that your analysts can actually do a better job of effectively triaging these activities as they're happening. Let the vendor start to figure out and help you with what is considered normal and what's not normal. And that's an assistance, right? Because you're going to know the normal. You're going to know what's not normal. But there's only so much knowledge that you might maintain because you have 6 different hats to handle. You might not only be just the analyst, but you might be the security architect, you might be the system engineer, you might be the DevOps guy. Your teams are short, security operations teams are very slim. So that's not only relying on you as the customer, but also your vendor, right? Your third party team that you're working with. That's an alliance. I always find it interesting when people say, it's a VAR, it's an MSSP, it's MSP. That's an alliance. Yeah, their title might be that, but they essentially are a +1 to the team. Like Access IT, they're essentially your +1 to your team to really figure out as to what's that full story look like, what's normal from day 1 to day 2. Have them be that extra extension to your team. Because it's extremely useful for analysts to really actually have this data at hand to perform the response. And having this at their fingertips, once again, cuts down on that dwell time, cuts down the potential exposure to your environment. Joining of metadata, really, it's easy to actually join once the metadata is extracted and you actually have the ability to isolate it, start researching against these activities as they carry out. Cool. Let me take a pause. Greg, any questions I need to answer, as of right now?
No additional questions. I saw Tina had posted something, and I'm not sure what people can see in the Q&A. But just to close the loop on one of the original questions, Tina just wanted to mention that, with the differences between NDR, EDR, MDR, right? I think that we touched on this before, but an MDR, and a managed detection and response service through an MSSP would likely have an NDR and EDR solution in play, right? Or they might integrate into whatever you're already running, right? But I think what it all goes back to is that the conversation that we're having today is not so much around a SIEM is this, and EDR is that, and NDR is that, right? It's more about the integration of all of those technologies and making them work together, right? The synergy there. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So managed detection response, if you're not familiar with that, that's normally like a strategic alliance with, one of your partners, MSSP, where they do level 1, level 2 triage. The level 3s typically ended up, being on your team. Level 4, that's an incident response engagement. That's a total different thing, even outside of MDR. They might actually have their own partner that they bring in to, sanitize and figure out what's gone wrong and how do we get you guys back up into operational, standards. Or an MSSP might actually more be on the break fix. They are monitoring everything. They even have the controls capabilities to control what you have on site. A lot of the times they have their own vendors that they work with. They'll either deploy those to your site, or even sometimes they actually have a program where they take what you have already purchased. They might up level it if you're missing something, like maybe you have an EDR, you have an NDR, but you don't have a SIEM. They might have a hosted SIEM. To that extent, they'll actually get trained up, because what they're doing is they're reaching out to the vendors. A lot of times we have our partners, they reach out to us and we train them up and bring the tackle box, much like what we do with the customer. Yeah. So EDR, NDR, SIEM, that's that full visibility, right? That's that SOC triad. So when you actually start getting into the how-to, right? You start looking at how do you actually detect these types of threats, right? So threat detection should be an ongoing process. It's never just a drop in the bucket and move on. Trends change, as we kind of went before on like the DIY. If you were to, create your own research, figure out the threat actor tactics and techniques, and then, from there, release your own detection. You have to cycle back through that, and your vendors need to be doing the same thing. Because in most cases, it requires human interaction. AI, ML, all of these fun marketing terms, these different systems, they have their place. I think AI is still a little bit behind. It might have a place at some point later down the line, but for right now, I think, ML has the capabilities a little bit more aligned to active security research. And lots of the research, but you still need the people behind it, right? So lots of the research, prototyping, testing, and the managing of the detection rules, it requires development, right? And it requires different silos of team. Our ATR team is broken out into security engineering. It's broken out into threat intelligence, because not all threat intel is created equally. Your vendor might have some, but they need to partner with things like Facebook and Google and those guys out there as well too that have, bigger resource. But you need to figure out what it needs to be whittled down into, what's beneficial to your vertical, but overall, what's essentially going to be something that needs to be alerted to your side of the house. Focusing on the threat actors' tactics and techniques. When you focus on their actual tactics, you're able to stalk and figure out from a shadow perspective, what are they doing? How did they carry this out? What were they looking for inside your environment too? And an NDR has the ability to correlate that from the perspective of what steps were they doing? If nobody's familiar here, one of the biggest things from a lot of different security research teams is that they're looking for that actor to enumerate your network, figure out what ports available, run a quick Nmap scan. What systems? Are your IPC shares open? Are we actually going to try to poison your NTLM environment to see if there's a way in there, especially red teamers, right? They're looking for those activities. They're acting as if, and I'd always employ a company to make sure that you have a penetration testing, plan, and that you have a response plan in case that actually happens. You got to look for ways of creating overlapping coverage. You want to see multiple rules firing for the same activity, because it creates confidence, right? You have a low-level SSL beacon happening in your environment, you have a moderate one, and then you have one step above that. That gets you the full spectrum of, are they really still trying to get something from my environment? Going forward into the how-to, this is where you actually start to look at triaging, investigation. This is where you get into it, right? A lot of the stuff needs to be done in the backstop. That needs to be done by your tool set. But you got to ask a question, investigate, get an answer, right? What's the detection trying to tell me? What did the threat actor do? And what additionally do they carry out? Now, that additional point, I'll touch on that at the end, because I'll give you a little bit of a story essentially around that. But when you actually look at your NDR, it should help you understand key questions, such as what extended activities did the attacker carry out additionally on top of that? When tools only provide just surface level context, you only get surface level remediation. And unfortunately, with today's attacks, that's not enough. When you begin your initial triage and investigation, it will need to commence to the answer of the who, when, and how of an attack. You need to not only fix that problem, you have to report it up to the team, especially if you're a publicly traded company, right? You have to have a response plan. You have to have sponsorship from your team to do a tabletop event to figure out these things before they actually become a problem. And going back to the, what additionally did the attacker carry out, that gets somewhere into the hunt, but it could be part of your investigation story. For one of our, customers a little while back, anonymized for this, TrickBot dropped on their environment. From there was some sort of full, exfil off of CKnife web shell, right? And that web shell is ultimately looking for an outside injection to get into the environment. Then they started laterally scanning in there. They saw some openings in their firewall. They got into a device. They grabbed some details, right? They beaconed out to the outside. What is my public IP address? How do I grab these details off of this server or this workstation? They didn't get what they were looking for, but they did in a way, because what they ended up doing is they dropped crypto miner on the rest of the machines throughout the entire environment. What crypto miner does is it utilizes your CPU, your RAM, and your processing power to farm Bitcoin. So not only did they grab something and you're going through an IR and that costs money, but they additionally drop something else to just say, hey, let's gain a little bit further monetary value and coin out of this, just because why not, right? Cool. So a little bit of a shell here, but ThreatINSIGHT is really composed of four main components: the sensor, the data warehouse, the analytics layer running on top of that data warehouse, and the front end, which consists of the portal interface, which is fully RESTful API. Right? Go back to before, right? Fully RESTful API. And the reason I mention that is that you need to co-process. Your NDR needs to work with your other tools, and your other tools need to work with NDR. EDR needs to work with NDR. NDR needs to work with your SIEM. creating that full picture, understanding, but you need that data at hand. And a lot of the times what ends up happening is that on-premise deployment that you might have done with NDR, it's not scalable, it's not fixable. So for us, we're completely built as a SaaS platform, and I'll show that in a demonstration later on, this evening for this this conference. But where you start breaking into these different areas, you need to make sure that you have the key flexibility at your tool, and you need to be able to push your vendor. They have to be open to change. Because if you're going to change and you're going to make that investment into this tool stack, they ultimately need to make sure that they're supporting you. And your demands might be high, but it should be. And they need to fit somewhere essentially in the middle there. So key takeaways. All right, NDR provides a visibility where EDR and SIEM cannot. All right, collecting the right data is the first and the most important step. It's got to be the data, but it has to be the enriched data. It's got to provide the necessary context to your analysts. It has to provide things like, what's the workstation name? Being able to pull things like passive DNS, Kerberos and NTLM. Who's logged into this box? What have they been doing? Is there a service account that's running rampant across our environment that we had no idea was still active? Are they running SQL Express from the software version? Is there a bad version of Apache Struts? The example I gave earlier from the DevOps team, right? They might be serving something up to the outside that they had no idea that version is exploitable. But if you don't have that version and that version, that software and that version, number, you're not going to know, right? Automating the actual network detection, right? It's based on threat actor tactics and techniques. Anomalistic based detections have their place. And we definitely look at that as ThreatINSIGHT, but we really figured out from all being former practitioners, like I said, myself, I was in that seat before. I felt the pain of the customer. You need to make sure that you have that ability to work on what's worth being detected and being able to actually have the data at hand to figure out, is that a true or false positive? Just getting the just trust this game from your vendor, it shouldn't work, and it doesn't work. A lot of times you end up filtering through things and having to figure out other ways to utilize this tool to get that answer. And workflows built from a customer analyst, right? The feedback for the effective response and the triage, right? You need to have the ability to build out those playbooks, figure out from that perspective, how would we actually address this, right? If you started matching yourself against the MITRE ATT&CK framework and building your company around that, your portfolio, you need to be able to actually be able to figure out not only from your governance, the support from your executive team, but additionally to that, how would we respond to that? And then rapid query responses, time against a large data set for quicker investigations. As we said before, SIEMs were not built to scale at that certain amount. Maybe some are, right? I could be speaking a little bit out of practice on that, but for the most part, the ones that I've interacted with, it hasn't been that long ago since I've had to utilize a SIEM. We still use it today at Gigamon. That's a lot. And the tool that you're using, especially for NDR, you need to be able to go back to that and have a presentation layer that's built for a practitioner. We built our tool ultimately as to, how do we pivot down into this? How do we add this into our investigation? Can I create my own detections off of this? Do I have a team supporting me additionally too? Because that's another takeaway that I didn't necessarily add into this, but it's one thing that I found your current trend and just the situation we're dealing with today, right? And we're all fairly well aware of it. And most of us are working from home at this point. Having a team that normally might have been on site still support you remotely and bring the tackle box to you, because NDR is another tool, right? And you need to have somebody that's technically sound and has been in your seat before, right? Our technical account managers have been in that seat. They're all former level practitioners. So great. With that, I'll open it up to any Q&A and answer any questions I can.
Yeah, hey, Bobby, this is Greg. Really appreciate the presentation. Thanks to you. Thanks to Gigamon for putting that on. I hope everything, that was talked about today was of some value to everybody that was on the presentation today. There is one open question on the Q&A. I figured we'll do it live, right?
Sure.
Since it's the end of the prezo. So a question from Rich here. If we need to monitor non-agent IoT devices, it just went away.
Oh, I think I see it here. Yeah. So if we need to monitor non-agent
Is
IoT devices.
NDR, yep, is NDR what we'd use since EDR can't be easily done, I'm assuming. And the answer is absolutely, right?
Yes. Yep.
So, working in the, VAR and professional services space here, we deal with a lot of different types of clients, right? Common enterprises, healthcare, manufacturing, right? When you get down to that type of vertical there, IoT is prevalent, and EDR goes out the door, honestly, right? Because how do you install an agent on like a heart monitor, or a weight price label line in a manufacturing facility? So the reality is, what Gigamon at least brings to the table here, we're talking about network visibility, right? That visibility fabric. How do we aggregate traffic so that we can feed tools that are good at identifying assets on the network that may be IoT, right? OT, IoT, but also identifying potential vulnerabilities within those systems, just by being able to aggregate, right? Tap and ag, and then flow map and filter traffic to those critical tools that need to see that data, right? Need to see that traffic, and do that classification, and give the security teams the visibility they need into what's actually on the network. So, the short answer is NDR, yes, right? EDR probably not possible, because you can't install those agents, right, on those types of machines. And I think Gigamon is very poised to deliver in that space, and help with the visibility for those tools.
Yeah, absolutely. And just adding to that, yeah. So Greg is spot on with that. In terms of those situations where it's you can't install an agent. It might not necessarily that you couldn't install the agent. Maybe the operating system isn't supported by that typical EDR. The other side of the house is that an NDR is passive in your environment. It's collecting those raw packets, sending it through, and then ultimately extrapolating that data to then have a research to run against it. I look at healthcare providers. A lot of the times, from HIPAA compliance, they're actually not allowed to deploy EDR just because of HPI. So from that, you have to deploy something like an NDR to really still get you that visibility. Is my vendor from IoT and OT, who are they reaching out to? Are they uploading things in plain text when they actually should be doing it securely? Especially data analytics, right? Everybody always presses that yes, for Privacy Act and being able to see my certain data. Do you know what it is though? And that's really where NDR can start to expose a lot of those areas to figure out, hey, do we need to address a firewall issue, or do we even need to contact that vendor to say, why do you need this data? It's supposed to be anonymized, but I see my account UUID associated to it. So in the event you get breached, that's going to cause me problems. So getting that visibility into your environment, is key. And having these three different types of technologies is really where you're going to start to fit. So I'll pass this over to Greg, but appreciate all the questions here. And if there's anything further, feel free to reach out to your account exec, and they can reach out to me, and I'm happy to do a deeper dive into the team.
Awesome. Thanks, Bobby. Again, thank you for the presentation. I hope everybody gained some value here. And just to go back on it, right? My name's Greg Ricketts. I'm an engineer and practice lead here with Access IT Group. We are a local value-added reseller for everyone here in the Carolinas. And me personally and specifically, I cover from Maryland down through the Carolinas, for all those technical services, activities that we perform here as a consulting group. I won't, read the slide to you, but, at a high level, if you're not familiar with us, right, we offer technical services, cloud services, and risk management services across the board. Specific to this presentation, while I lead the team here for technical services in the region, I'm also the primary Gigamon SE. And I've been, had the opportunity and the privilege of helping a lot of customers integrate Gigamon solutions to enhance their visibility and feed that fabric of tools, right, that require the visibility that you need to make real, risk-based decisions. Whether the end tool is, something like a ThreatINSIGHT that I'm hopeful you guys join the demo later, or if it's another tool like to Rich's question earlier, like an IoT discovery tool, classification tool, even if it's like an inline IPS or other third-party ecosystem partners like a FireEye, et cetera, that I'm sure everyone's familiar with. We've been able to architect and design a number of solutions that hit those points and achieve those security objectives and goals there. Engage us early, engage us often. We're happy to answer questions and help you through that journey, and sort of further explain how Gigamon plays a real part in your network and security stack there, to elevate that security posture.
Great. Super. Bobby, Greg, thank you all very much. For those of you who have joined us, this will also be being recorded and will be available. I encourage you all to go to the vendor locations and to reach out to the different vendors that are out there, as well as please go ahead and on the main screen of the webpage, there is a survey. Please complete a survey for this session, so that Bobby and Greg can get your feedback as to how well they did, and we can use this moving forward. Thank you all very much. Bobby, Greg, any last comments?
No, thank you for everybody attending here, and look forward to speaking more in depth with the team here. As I said earlier, I do have a demonstration of ThreatINSIGHT later on today. So if you're interested in seeing what our NDR tool can do, please go ahead and sign up for that.
Right.
With that, I'll say thank you to everybody.